This splendid wooden effigy of the mummified King Tutankhamun is a Shawabti figure, one of over 400 that were found in the tomb with him. Strictly, all such statuettes should have been made from the Shawab tree, but the ancient Egyptians forgot the origin of the name and later called them Ushabti or answerers. This is not inappropriate, since they were supposed to answer for the dead man in the hereafter. As in Egypt itself, so in the underworld, irrigation works had to be rapidly undertaken at critical moments of the flood. To avoid such toilsome duties, which would have made a mockery of paradise, these magic substitutes, the Shawabtis, would be put to work by the recitation of the spell written upon them. A belief in such magic was widespread all over the ancient world, but it is only the ancient Egyptians who are now credited in popular belief with supernatural powers that can persist.
Along with curses and sorcery, the ancient Egyptians are perhaps chiefly celebrated in popular imagination for being dead and embalmed, a view which rows of coffins and mummies in museums do nothing to correct. And supernatural ideas of the survival of the personality and even the persons of Egyptian mummies have inspired a whole tradition of literature, from a mummy story from ancient Egypt itself, through the romantic tales of Rider Haggard and Conan Doyle, down to the horror film of today. A similar awesome feeling may also be induced not only in the presence of the immeasurably old, but of the immeasurably huge too. And these colossal monuments can often overawe merely by their great size. It was the ambition of every early explorer in the first decades of the 19th century to bring one back to Europe. Some of the statues, unfortunately, are apt to convey a feeling of official vapidity in their inspiration and mechanical heartlessness in their execution, though they can be masterpieces of the monumental style. This lion, which Tutankhamun found rough-hewn in a quarry left over from his father's reign and finished for his temple in the Sudan, was praised by Ruskin for its monumental dignity achieved by the simplest means. From Genesis and Exodus comes the image of ancient Egypt as a land of oppression, where gigantic monuments were raised only by the toil of innumerable slaves groaning under the lash of the taskmaster. The classical authors have given us a picture of a mysterious land locked away in its African deserts, immensely old even when the Greeks first came looking for their origins, abounding in wonders and magic, but inexplicably devoted to the worship of gods in brute forms. Yet there are other sides to all these pictures. This was a land where, despite the exaggerated respect accorded to animals, a pharaoh, in the days before Israel, could impose on his subjects the worship of an abstract and single god manifest in the light from the sun. And alongside the colossal pieces, there are smaller works of art that the ancient world has handed down to us, which are charming and still have an appeal, even after thousands of years. The aloof and conquering kings are human enough also to embrace their wives or submit to their attentions. On this gold-paneled shrine from his tomb, Tutankhamun dallies with his queen Ankhesenamun, pouring perfume into her hand. And so far from the tomb being a place of unrelieved sorrow, heavy with the mementos of death, the ancient Egyptians preferred to leave pictures showing themselves enjoying the life they'd passed on earth, in scenes full of vivid observation and sly humor, like these girls quarreling in a cornfield. And the same humorous observation is apparent in many such unpretentious figures. This buxom girl making beer. And sketches like this girl acrobat. If we disregard these conflicting images of the colossal and the miniature, of superstition and philosophy, of morbid solemnity and frivolous gaiety, and simply ask what after all were the ancient Egyptians, the answer is that for the most part, like their descendants today, they were farmers, dedicated to tilling the soil of Egypt. In its crops and livestock lay the wealth of ancient Egypt. The peasants toiling in the fields formed the broad base of the social pyramid, and at the peak stood the pharaoh. An ancient Egyptian folk story called The Tale of Two Brothers describes an ideal life as an annual round of ploughing, sowing, reaping, and tending the cattle in the fields. The appeal of such a story would be readily understood by a rustic audience who well knew the days of winnowing, when the standing crops were measured, the yield assessed, and the threshed grain reckoned in standard containers, all under the eye of the land agent. Today, increased aridity and overexploitation have changed the natural environment. But in antiquity, there were areas, particularly in the delta, where the reeds and papyrus rushes abounded and gave shelter to immense shoals of fish and flocks of pond fowl. This is the mortuary temple of Ramesses III. On an outer wall, he had this picture carved. It shows him hunting the wild bulls of the marshlands. There were great herds of wild cattle to be hunted there, a favorite sport of the pharaohs. The desert wadis, ravines and valleys that at that time were fertile, supported wild game. Hares, ibex, gazelles, all prey to the ancient Egyptians' trained hunting dogs. From these same wadis, the natural predators, the lion and other wild beasts, could still descend upon the settlements to carry off the farmers' livestock. Besides their rich crops, the Egyptians boasted of their prize cattle, fattened for sacrifice to the gods or for display on the day they were counted for census purposes. In the time of the Middle Kingdom, around 4,000 years ago, a noble named Meket Rey took with him into his tomb this model of a cattle census on his estates, complete with many beasts and their herdsmen. The model includes a scene where the chief herdsman is making his report to one of Meket Ray's stewards. The power and prestige of ancient Egypt rested mainly on its farming, and in this respect it was the wealthiest country in the ancient world, though its immense gold reserves and monopoly of tropical products made it esteemed and courted by the other nations. Nevertheless, it was its flesh pots that were celebrated and envied among its less fortunate neighbors, its surplus grain succoring the Hittites in their days of famine, as well as the city mob 1,000 years later in the time of imperial Rome. Small wonder, therefore, that the farmer saw the afterlife as some Egyptian paradise where perpetual spring prevailed. The corn grew to a height of 9 cubits, and its cultivation provided the fortunate inhabitants with their chief occupation. Here is how the poet, Païbes, described the great city of Ramesses, on the building of which in the 13th century BC the Israelites were supposed to have toiled.
Its fields are full of all good things, and it has provisions and sustenance every day. Its channels abound in fish, and its lakes in birds. Its plots are green with herbage, and its banks bear dates. Its granaries are overflowing with barley and wheat, and they reach unto the sky. Fruits and fish are there for sustenance, and wine surpassing honey. He who dwells there is happy, and there the humble man is like the great elsewhere.
The ancient Egyptians were a greatly privileged community, inhabiting a rainless land that straggled a long, narrow oasis for hundreds of miles in the African deserts, but was blessed with a prodigious fertility. An Egyptian, looking across the Nile, could see the boundaries of his world in the rich mud that was deposited each year by the flooding of the great river. Beyond this narrow, fertile belt was tawny desert, mostly sterile and inhospitable. To the ancient Egyptian, the division between cultivation and aridity, life and death, good and evil, was clear and complete. We now know that it is the rains falling in early summer on the Abyssinian uplands that swell the blue Nile into the raging torrent which carries its fertilizing silt for hundreds of miles. But the ancient Egyptians believed that it was the waters that were under the earth, that welled up each year from subterranean caverns, notably at the first cataract in Upper Egypt, and submerged their land. To this simple circumstance, Egypt owed her fertility, indeed her very existence, and the character of her ancient civilization. Except at rare intervals when a succession of low Niles brought the years of the hyena when men went hungry, or when too high a flood destroyed the protective dams and dikes, the beneficent river spread its life-giving waters and fertilizing mud over the exhausted land in an annual miracle of rebirth. The ancients thought of the waters of the Nile as able to create life out of death and as charged with divine power. In about 1840 BC, the princess Sit Hathor-Unet had a magnificent alabaster jar placed in her tomb with a prayer on it, asking for a draught of those cool waters which beget all living things. The Nile was personified as a corpulent, well-fed man bearing the produce of the river, fish, flowers, and fowl. A hymn describes him as the father of the gods, abundance, the food of Egypt. Everyone rejoices on the day you come forth from your cavern. And when early Greek travelers described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, they merely put into words a thought which had been in the Egyptian psyche since time immemorial. The farmers' labors, though well rewarded, were onerous, and except at the height of the flood, almost continuous. They were largely concerned with irrigation. The higher-lying fields had to be laboriously watered by means of the shaduf, or well sweep. Those still in use today exactly resemble the ones the ancient Egyptians employed. Besides growing corn, Egypt had a large population of domestic animals such as oxen and sheep and goats. There were pigs and donkeys, and in later times, the horse too. The breeders of cattle and herdsmen led a freer and more nomadic life in the natural surroundings of their animals, the marshlands, particularly those of the delta with their lush pasturage and thickets of rush. To the cultivators they appeared uncouth and a trifle ridiculous, but they probably evaded much of the forced labor that fell to the lot of the farmer. But the vast majority of the Egyptians were committed to the cultivation of the land, as much by desire as by necessity. They were deeply attached to the soil and unhappy away from their valley. In their tombs, the great nobles of the Old Kingdom delighted to be depicted on the carved and painted walls as surveying every aspect of country life on their estates and watching with a benevolent eye all the cycle of the agricultural year.